Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. I welcome all my students to today's lecture regarding the stomach functions. This is the first lecture regarding stomach functions. Now let's talk about the autonomic control of the gastrointestinal tract. Now, parasympathetic stimulation increases the activity of the enteric nervous system. Cranial parasympathetic nerve fibers, they are almost entirely in the vagus nerve. That's why vagus nerve is also known as the nerve of gut. Now these fibers, they provide extensive innervation to the esophagus, stomach and pancreas, and somewhat less to the intestines down through the first half of the large intestine. Now regarding the autonomic control of gastrointestinal tract, we should know that the sacral parasympathetics, they originate in the second, third and fourth sacral segments of the spinal cord, and they pass through the pelvic nerves to the distal half of the large intestine and all the way down to anus. The sigmoidal, rectal and anal regions, they are considerably better supplied with parasympathetic fibers than are the other intestinal areas. Now these fibers, they function especially to execute the defecation reflexes. Stimulation of sacral parasympathetic nerves, they cause general increase in activity of the enteric nervous system. Now, when we are talking about the autonomic nervous control system of the gastrointestinal tract, we should also know the sympathetic stimulation role. Now, keep this thing in mind that sympathetic stimulation is usually having the role of inhibition. The sympathetic fibers to gastrointestinal tract, they originate in the spinal cord between segments T5 and L2. Most of the preganglionic fibers that innervate the gut after leaving the cord enters the sympathetic chains that lie lateral to spinal column, and many of these fibers then pass on through the chains to outlying ganglia such as to celiac ganglion and various mesenteric ganglions. Now postganglionic fibers then spread through postganglionic sympathetic nerves to all parts of the gut. The sympathetics, they innervate essentially all of the gastrointestinal tract. Now these sympathetic nerve endings, they secrete mainly norepinephrine but also small amount of epinephrine. Stimulation of sympathetic nervous system exerts its effects in two ways. And what are they? First one is to slight extent by direct effect of a secreted norepinephrine to inhibit the intestinal tract smooth muscle, except the mucosal muscles, which it excites, and to major extent by an inhibitory effect of norepinephrine on the neurons of the entire gut. Strong stimulation of sympathetic system can inhibit the motor movements of the gut so greatly that this can literally block movement of food through the gastrointestinal tract. Now let's talk about the efferent sensory nerve fibers from the gut. Now many efferent sensory nerve fibers, they innervate the gut, and these can be stimulated by the irritation of gut mucosa, excessive distension of the gut, presence of specific chemical substances in the gut. Now signals transmitted through these fibers can then cause excitation. Other sensory signals from the gut, they go all the way to multiple areas of the spinal cord and even the brain stem. For example, 80% of the nerve fibers in the vagus nerves are efferent. Now these efferent fibers, they transmit sensory signals from the gastrointestinal tract into the brain medulla, which in turn initiates vagal reflex signals that return to the gastrointestinal tract to control many of its functions. Now let's talk about different gastrointestinal reflexes. The anatomical arrangement of the enteric nervous system and its connections with the sympathetic and parasympathetic systems support three types of gastrointestinal reflexes which are essential for the gastrointestinal control, homeostasis, etc. Now they are following. First one is the reflexes which are integrated entirely within the gut wall enteric nervous system. These include reflexes which control much of the gut secretions, peristalsis, mixing, contractions, local inhibitory effects, and so forth. Reflexes from the gut to the prevertebral sympathetic ganglia and then back to gastrointestinal tract. These reflexes they transmit signals long distances to other areas of gastrointestinal tract such as gastrocolic reflex, enterogastric reflexes, the colono-ileal reflex. So let's talk about them one by one. The first one, the gastrocolic reflex, signals from the stomach to cause evacuation of the colon. Then enterogastric reflexes, signals from the colon and small gut to inhibit stomach motility and stomach secretion. The colono-ileal reflex, reflexes from the colon to inhibit emptying of the ileal contents into the colon. Now reflexes from the stomach and duodenum to the brainstem and back to the stomach by way of the vagus nerves to control gastric motor and secretory activity. Then pain reflexes that cause general inhibition of the entire gastrointestinal tract. Defecation reflexes which travel from colon and rectum to spinal cord and back again to produce the powerful colonic, rectal and abdominal contractions required for defecation, the defecation reflexes. Now let's talk about the hormonal control of gastrointestinal motility. The gastrointestinal hormones they are released into the portal circulation and they exert physiological actions on the target cells with specific receptors for the hormone. The effects of hormones they persist even after all nervous connections between the site of release and the site of action have been cut off. Now what are they? Gastrin, cholecystokinin, secretin, GIP, that is gastric inhibitory peptide, motilin. Let's talk about them one by one. The first one is the gastrin, the stimulus for its secretion, that is distension and protein in food. The site of secretion is the G cells of antrum, duodenum and jejunum, and its function is to stimulate the gastric acid secretion and mucosal growth. Then cholecystokinin, the stimuli for secretion, they are protein, fat, acid, and they are being secreted from I cells of the duodenum, jejunum and ileum, and action is to stimulate the pancreatic enzyme secretion, pancreatic bicarbonate secretion, gallbladder contraction, growth of exocrine pancreas, and it inhibits the gastric emptying. Secretin releases as a result of fat in food, secreted from S cells of duodenum, jejunum, ileum, and it stimulates the pepsin secretion, pancreatic bicarbonate secretion, biliary bicarbonate secretion, growth of exocrine pancreas, and it inhibits the gastric acid secretion. Then comes GIP, release as a result of protein, fat, and carbohydrate in food, and is secreted from the K cells of duodenum and jejunum. It stimulates the insulin release and it inhibits the gastric acid secretion. Then comes motilin. Motilin is secreted as a result of fat or due to nerve excitability and secreted from M cells of duodenum and jejunum, and it stimulates the gastric motility, intestinal motility. Now let's talk about different pathophysiological terms, which are number one, dysphagia. Dysphagia means difficulty in swallowing, which is accompanied by a sensation of sticking or obstruction of the passage of food through the mouth, pharynx, or esophagus. Then another term, that is odynophagia, which means painful swallowing. Then dysphagia and odynophagia occurs simultaneously. Classification of dysphagia. It can be classified into two types, that is oropharyngeal dysphagia and esophageal dysphagia. Oropharyngeal dysphagia. The tongue may fail to push the bolus of food into esophagus, and there may be aspiration with swallowing, regurgitation of fluids through the nose, or pharyngeal pain with swallowing. Causes can be cerebrovascular accidents, polyneuritis, diphtheria, myasthenia gravis, pharyngitis, enlarged thyroid gland, iron deficiency anemia, tetanus. Then comes esophageal dysphagia. It can result from mechanical narrowing of the esophagus, for example, cancer of esophagus or surrounding tissue, stricture of esophagus because of corrosive agents, inflammatory diseases, or injury. Motility disturbances, diffuse esophageal spasm or achalasia, the relaxation of lower esophageal sphincter in response to swallowing is incomplete. So this is all about today's lecture, and inshallah we'll continue later on. Stay blessed. Allah